What is it about heavy metal and its obsession with the dark side, its obsession with witches and witchcraft, and the outer reaches of the human soul? I guess it's just something that teenage boys like to get into, but the popularity of the witch crazes remains incredibly strong. So what we're going to do in this module is have a look at the witch crazes, have a look at issues around demonic possession, and compare it to the more naturalistic explanations of madness that emerged at around about the same time and were based upon the humoral way of thinking. But first, we start with the witches. From the late 15th century right the way through the 16th and into the 17th century, across Europe there was a great witch craze. The witches were being sought out and found absolutely everywhere, serving as the minions of Beelzebub and his hordes. Basically what would happen is that any woman found behaving oddly might be accused and then questioned and then tortured or tested and eventually confess to being a witch. And here we see one of the many punishments that would befall you, being burnt alive. Here, from the early 16th century in Germany, we see a range of punishments that were reserved for witches and sorcerers. And as I indicated, confession was often extracted under torture by men like Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed witch-finder general, seeking out witches and their familiars and then ensuring that they're cast into hell, having been burnt at the stake. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, was the textbook that guided individuals like Hopkins. That such a work should be published indicates the cultural power of the idea. And as we can see from this table, right the way across Europe, even into America, thousands of women were burnt at the stake. This, however, was not the only area in which Satan seemed to be hard at work. Witches and sorcerers could use their powers to possess with demons other individuals. Again, across this period, but particularly in the 17th century, there were a number of cases of mass possession in the convent where huge numbers of nuns became seemingly possessed with demonic spirits. So between the 14th century and the 17th century, there were many, many mass possessions of nuns in the convent. Once categorized as diabolical, the treatment for this form of possession was exorcism in an effort to expel the demons. At Loudun, the spiritual advisor of the convent was accused of being the individual that had facilitated the possession of the nuns. It was believed that his actions were responsible for them becoming possessed, that he himself was in league with Satan. And Grandier was arrested, interrogated, tortured, was burned for the sin of possessing the nuns. Now, looking back in time at these events, it appears such a different and strange world, a world completely and utterly divorced from our modern culture. And of course, we try to make sense of that. One way of making sense of it is thinking that witches were running amok through Europe during this period. That, however, would not be particularly sensible. And in general, there have been two particular strands of interpretation when people have been trying to figure out why it was that so many individuals who were accused of witchcraft actually confessed to it, why their strange behaviour led them to being accused in the first place. One of those strands of interpretation is psychiatric. The insistence that actually what was being experienced by many of the witches that were accused, or what was being experienced by the nuns who were possessed in the convent, some form of mass hysteria. The other form of explanation particularly in regards to possession, was that assuming the role of a possessed individual allowed that individual to express dissent within confined social settings like the convent. In terms of the witches, the identification of the witch, the community saying it looks like that person is a witch because she's put a curse on my pigs and those pigs have died, or that person is a witch and I know that she cursed my husband and he is now impotent. The identification of the witch allowed for the expression of social tensions within the community. And here it is well to remember that the period within which this occurred was the Reformation, when Martin Luther and then his followers challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, and then the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church hit back. It was a time of enormous spiritual schism, a time when communities and countries were divided, and somehow witchcraft seems to fall into the social and cultural crack that is created by these schisms. It is worth exploring at this point the figure of Johann Weyer, who was a Dutch physician and demonologist, and subsequently has been celebrated as one of the many fathers of psychiatry. How did he achieve that role? Well, principally because of his stance on witches, when he insisted that the women who were accused were almost certainly not guilty of having an association with Satan. Indeed, they're not evil, but mentally disturbed. And in his work on the illusion of demons, he made this point quite explicitly. So in this regard, it's quite easy to perceive him as being a very modern figure who gravitated towards a naturalistic explanation of psychiatric disturbance. However, as John Waller reminds us, he remained very much mired in his times, a demonologist who still believed in the power of the devil, just that the witches that were accused were in no way in league with the devil and his minions and were not aiming to do ill. Witchcraft and demonic possession were exceptional because for the previous nearly 2,000 years, a way of thinking about disease had developed that was almost, but not quite, entirely naturalistic. In other words, it relied upon natural rather than supernatural explanations for disease, and that is all disease. The figure that we always go to when we talk about this system of thinking is Hippocrates, because we assume that he was the founder of this school of thinking. Hippocrates was radical because he argued that the vast majority of disease was a natural phenomenon. And it was a natural phenomenon that was caused by imbalance in living. And the aim of the physician was setting the balance to rights to restore health. And as I've said, this was all disease, not just physical disease, but mental disease as well. There is not a dividing line between the two. Now, the major means of restoring balance was to target this group called the non-naturals. The non-naturals were air, food, exercise, sleep, emotions, cleansing, and sexuality. And too much or too little of all of these things could, depending upon the constitution of the body, result in disease. And just as they could result in disease, re-regulating in the right way could set the body back to rights. Now, these ideas were taken up into the Roman Empire by Galen. Galen systematized this, producing copious works that survived for hundreds of years. And one of the reasons they survived is that upon the collapse of the Roman Empire and its division into the Eastern and Western Empire, we begin to see the rise of Islam. They take the old classical texts, and individuals like Avicenna, that's his Latin name, or Ibn Sina, develop them, propagate them, and create the canon of medicine, which then when Islam comes banging up against Europe from the 12th century onwards, is passed back into a Europe that has forgotten much of this knowledge. Now, it has to be remembered that God and the devil remained potential causes of disease right the way into the early modern period, as we've seen in the case of witchcraft. The humoral worldview, as it developed from Hippocrates onwards, was based upon the idea that 4 elements combine to make everything in the body, including water, air, earth and fire. These corresponded to the 4 seasons, when each of those elements were in their element: water in winter, air in spring, fire for heat in summer, and earth for autumn. The 4 seasons could then be mapped onto 4 organs of production: the lungs, the liver, the gallbladder, the spleen, each of which produce 4 humours: phlegm, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and in turn 4 qualities. Combined together, these could create 4 personality types, 4 temperaments: the phlegmatic, the calm, the sanguine, the optimistic, the choleric, the impulsive and the angry, and the melancholic, the reflective and perhaps depressed. Depending on when you were born, what season you were born in, or what stage of life you happen to be in, you might experience a preponderance of one humour over another, or the natural humours within your body might come out of balance. We can see the power of this model in determining the kind of individual that you were by looking at this medieval illustration demonstrating each of the 4 temperaments. From the top quadrant, phlegmatic, sanguine, choleric and melancholic, each to their own temperament. Working through the implications of this, health and illness are a matter of balance, imbalance and predisposition. Health is when everything is in balance, as it should be, both the naturals, the humours, your predispositions, the time of the year, and the non-naturals. Illness, then, is an imbalance when these matters are thrown out of their proper order. You might be predisposed to certain conditions because of your dominant humour. The season itself might affect the humoral balance. But the critical thing is that mental disturbance, for example melancholia, is just another state of imbalance. It is a condition of both body and mind. And we can see this in the implications of the humoral model, within which the body is completely integrated into the environment. It is a fundamentally holistic way of thinking about bodies and minds in sickness and health. We can see too that character, health and illness are all constructed within this cosmology, with the body and mind integrated. Mental upset could cause physical upset, but so too the opposite. Physical upset could cause mental upset. The balance model means that the two are really indistinguishable. In terms of treating disease, and this holds whether we are thinking about a cold or a bout of depression, there are a number of ways that physicians sought to restore balance. They might do so through regulating the non-naturals, things like sleep and diet and exercise, or they might use therapies to counter the preponderance of a particular humour. And sometimes these ways of restoring balance could be extremely violent. Over the course of history, by the 16th and 17th century, the methods included bleeding. One of the explanations for mania could be an excess of blood. How better to calm the system down and remove the mania than drawing blood off from the body. Cupping and blistering were also important methods. Drawing the peccant humours, the humours that were out of whack, to the surface of the body. Baths and bathing could regulate temperature, but also, by ensuring cleanliness, could maintain a general standard of health. By the 17th century, herbal medicines were becoming increasingly popular. Poisons, once again, there might be too much of a humour whizzing around the body. What better way to get it out than poisoning the body and making the patient throw up. And then things like diet and exercise could be used and were regarded, even into the 19th century, as a highly effective means of treating the body and mind in sickness and in health. As a case study of the humoral system and its relationship to mental disturbance, where better than to look at Robert Burton's compendious and astounding work, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Robert Burton, who, tipping his hat to the genius of the classical scientist Democritus, named himself Democritus Jr. I think that it is significant that he chose Democritus, because Democritus, after all, put forward a very materialistic view of the universe that saw the whole cosmos being constructed out of small atomic units. And Burton's approach to melancholy was very much from this naturalistic perspective. On the whole, the causes of melancholy were entirely natural. Burton was a divine, a vicar, ordained in the Church of England, as was the way with academics then. Not only was he ordained, he also happened to be a scholar at Oxford University. But his other claim to fame, and something that he was open about, was the fact that he was melancholic. He published The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, but right the way until his death in 1640, he kept on writing and rewriting and revising, so that many editions came out during his lifetime. Basically, the book expanded and expanded. Here we see the frontispiece, looking at significant states and treatments and ideas surrounding melancholy. As much as it is a medical textbook, it was also a work of literature that combined a whole range of different fields: philosophy, astrology, natural history, all to analyse his subject, all to understand it. What better way to get a sense of the holistic body-mind condition of melancholy than combining all forms of knowledge in a broad natural philosophy? But not only did he study melancholy, he also studied his own condition. And here he started off with his place in the cosmos, working out his predispositions according to the state of the stars at his birth. But most of all, it pays to look at Burton's causes of melancholia if we're to see the balance between the natural and the supernatural in mental disturbances at the time that Burton was writing. Here we see a reproduction of Burton's view of the causes of melancholia. And we can see at the top of the list things like diet. We're looking at the non-naturals here: substance, bread, coarse and black, drink, thick, thin, sour, water, unclean, milk, oil, vinegar, wine, species, flesh. On and on it goes. Too much of one, not enough of another, depending upon our predisposition, working our way down the list. Air, hot, cold, tempestuous. This is right out of Hippocrates. You could not find a better illustration of the working of the non-naturals within the condition of melancholia. Again, working down the list. Here we see the supernatural brought forward as a potential cause of melancholia, as from God immediately, or by second causes, or from the devil immediately, with a digression of the nature of spirits and devils, or immediately by magicians and witches. So God or the devil could instantly cause it through their power. Magicians and witches could call upon the services of God or the devil to inflict melancholia upon an individual. But look at the small size of that box and compare it with the natural causes. The stars, old age, temperament, parents, so a hereditary disease, working right the way down to it actually being a sequelae of other imbalances, of other disorders. Melancholia, produced by the preponderance of black bile or a predisposition that was the result of the stars under which you were born, was one of the principal mental illnesses of Burton's period. And I suppose that it's tempting to see depression as being the immediate successor of melancholia. But in reality, because of its place within the humoral system, melancholia was so much more than just a mental disturbance. It was almost a way of life. It was certainly deeply natural, and it was most definitely a condition of both body and mind that was open to interventions both through the non-naturals but also through the medical use of treatments like bleeding. And because in this model body and mind were virtually indissoluble, the principal forms of therapy were somatic.